Right now, a mother from Castle Rock alleges that her kids are the targets of racist bullying in school, and not enough is being done about it.
Frustration and disappointment from a Poway father who says he's had enough. He says his son has endured months of bullying and racist comments with no action from the school or the district.
I just feel like it's blatant incompetence from the schools.
A Folsom High School teen says that she has become the target of racist bullies both at school and online. And tonight, the teen's mother is calling for the school to do more to protect her.
3 parents are suing the Duval County School District, claiming their kids were subjected to racist acts.
"Build the wall higher" was scrawled across this 12-foot wall in letters 18 inches high. The graffiti greeted kindergartners through 8th graders as they arrived to school Monday morning. 75% of the students here at Kali Kalmecca Language Academy are Latino.
So a Washington school district decided today that Asians are not students of color. This would have been great to know growing up, because whenever someone pulled their eyes back or called me a chink or told me to go back to my country, I could have just been like, wait guys, I'm one of you.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Feudernick, and as you probably surmised from the intro you just heard, my guest and I will be talking about a painful and pernicious problem, racism in our schools. And as you will hear me share with some data points in a few minutes, this is no small problem. It's not an aberration, something that happens only occasionally. Reports of racism in schools show that it's quite prevalent, that it has nearly doubled in the last 3 to 4 years, and that the impact on students emotionally, socially, academically is often quite devastating. Just a quick note here, what we are not going to be discussing in this particular episode because of time are policies and practices, system level factors in schools, in other words, that discriminate against students because of race. That problem will be the focus of a future episode. But the idea here is for us to first understand how interpersonal racism plays out in our schools and to consider these 3 questions. What can be done to prevent it? What should educators do when it happens? And finally, how should students learn about racism in schools? Well, there are many perspectives, of course, on these questions, and often dramatically different ones. And I suspect you will hear some of them expressed from guests that have joined us today. Oh, just a note about the approach we take on this podcast. If you have not listened to other episodes, I've asked my guests to be part of this conversation, not as a debate to score points or with a sense of contempt for people with different viewpoints, but with a sense of empathy, curiosity, and a desire to understand the different perspectives that emerge. Differences of opinion, skepticism, healthy conflict about these complex questions are welcome, of course. Who knows, we might even discover some common ground. Let's take a moment to meet our guests. And Lori, I'm going to start with you. Would you tell our guests about you, where you're from, and what your connection to schools is?
My name is Lori Gaddis Barrett, and I'm from Rhode Island. And I am likely one of what most people would call a COVID mom, where I started becoming more interested in education policy during COVID as I was watching my child learn through distance learning. Prior to that, I was the PTO mom. I was the one that went in and made sure the classrooms had Kleenexes and things like that. In the course of my advocacy and desiring to learn more about education policy and how to become more effective with my local legislators, I wound up founding a parents group. And that has been a really rewarding aspect to some of the advocacy work that I do, because I get to talk to so many great parents that are really interested and working hard to learn more about how they can help schools.
Great. Thanks so much, Lori. Glad you're with us today. Kenan, I'm going to come to you next. Tell us about you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kenan Mackenzie DeFranza. I am the president of our North Shore branch of the NAACP here in Massachusetts. Also, career-wise length, an educator in K-12 and in higher ed. And I'm the founding director for the Tufts Generous Listening and Dialogue Center. And in addition to that work, Ken and I also met through some of that bridging work that happens with facilitation and dialogue. And I also have a podcast called The Aspiring Spirit, where I have these conversations about some of these challenging community conversations.
Yeah, I was particularly drawn to what I heard you say and your interest in having conversations like this that allow people with different perspectives to listen and understand one another. So I'm really, really happy you're here. Chris, how about you next? Tell our audience or listeners about you.
My name is Chris Kulesha. I am a scholar in child health policy at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, where I study the social determinants of health in K through 12 education. So I work with various school districts doing evaluation projects to understand how certain interventions impact academic performance and student well-being. I have a 23-month-old son who is extremely energetic. My wife and I did our PhDs at Purdue University, and in my volunteer time, I am the executive director of the Texas Young Republicans. I'm serving in my 4th term as that.
Terrific. Great to have you with us, Chris. And finally, Jordanis, tell our audience about you. And you're the one person who is currently still in high school.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jordanis Lemma. I am a current junior in Pennsylvania. And a little bit about me, I am super passionate about educational equity. As someone who grew up and as a traditionally overlooked student, being first generation, being low income, I really found a passion in educational equity, and I want to make sure that every student is given adequate education. And in my community, I do that specifically through the Cultural Proficiency and Equity Student Ambassadors. And with that group, we teach students self-advocacy skills and give them the tools that they need to make sure that they advocate for themselves and for their peers.
Well, great. Thank you for that. So I want to begin the conversation about racism in schools by having each of you talk about how you have been affected by racism when you were in school, or in the case of Jordanis, while you are in school. Lori, I'll start with you.
Okay, I grew up in a very small town in a northern New England state, which wasn't Rhode Island. And when I went to school, there wasn't a lot of diversity. And it just so happened that one of the most popular girls in my grade was a member of what I would now call the BIPOC community. And so for me, when I was growing up in school, we just didn't see that, or if we did, it didn't seem to make a difference to our friendships and relationships. But I see a different thing happening in today's education with my own daughter.
Mm. And in the work you do in schools where you are now in Rhode Island, have you witnessed racism, or I'm sure you've read about it happening in local schools? Is that true?
Yes, and it's happening more pervasively than I would have expected, and I have some theories on why that might be. But I also I get concerned sometimes about the allegations or accusations of racism between the students themselves and what that looks like.
Great. Well, I'm sure we'll get an opportunity for you to talk about that a little bit later as we get into some of the other questions. Kenan, I'm going to come to you next. Share an experience or an observation you've had with racism in schools.
Sure. Well, my name's pronounced Kenan. I'm named after my parents, Ken and Ann. I have a lot of experiences, so I'm trying to keep it specific. One of them I would say was with my son. We were at a school where we were probably the only Black family, or maybe two, in a particular independent school class. And he came home saying that children were telling him that he was covered in mud, that he was dirty, that his skin was dirty. And he didn't actually understand what that was or why they were saying that. We had not talked about race in our household. We didn't use the terms Black and white. We intentionally didn't want him thinking about the world that way. I'm also from a country where racism was just not a thing I knew about when I was a child. And I felt like it benefited me to be unaware for a while about those things. And so I was really distraught that he found out that way, that people thought there were skin color differences that were negative. And so the response from the school was really great. We got together as parents and basically talked openly with our children about what melanin was and what the differences were and so forth. But as a parent, it was very painful because he had nightmares for a while. He was afraid that his white friends would suddenly not be his friend, and he was only 5. And I realized early on that in this country, just the optics and the difference of color was going to mean having those conversations earlier than I would have had in my own childhood. So when I came to this country, I immediately had lots of many scenarios that I could go over all the time in school. And I felt like I had some resilience because I had the formative years of knowing that how I was made was just fine in God's eyes. But I think that for someone who was 5, learning that for the first time, it was really hard and traumatic for him to encounter that. That was, for me, really the first time my own child had experienced that. And I think I took for granted that I'd worked my way through it into adulthood, but I never saw someone have to deal with that at such a young age.
What country did you live in before coming here?
I'm from Guyana.
Okay, great. Chris, I'm going to come to you next. Share an experience you've had with racism in schools or something you've experienced directly or witnessed.
Sure. So my biggest impression came when I transferred from my elementary to middle school. So I was very blessed regarding my education. My parents enrolled me in some of the best private schools in Southeast Michigan. The secular Montessori school that I attended through 4th grade was extremely diverse, and the students and the teachers embraced that. The students were children of business and medical professionals of international firms, and each of my closest friends was of a different religious and racial background. Most of my friends were Indian, Filipino, Japanese, and Chinese. And growing up, I went to each other's, their houses and celebrated Diwali and Lunar New Year with them. So I was very fortunate with my elementary school experience. However, my Catholic middle school was quite different. Catholic middle schools can be incredibly diverse. The one that I attended was not. And when I made the transfer, I was honestly very shocked about the lack of diversity and how few non-white students and teachers there were. The diverse classroom that I knew before just did not exist. And the school environment was far less welcoming and accepting, and it was incredibly cliquish. There was no emphasis on celebrating different cultures. My Catholic high school, however, there was much more diversity. Now, reflecting on that, I'm very concerned about my son's education. My wife is Latina, so my son is both of Mexican and European background. He attends an incredible Montessori daycare right now where he's learning both Spanish and English. But I want him to have the same experience that I had in elementary school. And I want him to be accepted wherever he is and be accepting of others as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Chris. Jordanis, we're going to come to you last and have you share an experience of your own about racism.
The first thing that came to mind when I heard this question was around when the Ebola outbreak first started to happen. I was in elementary school, and my family comes from Ethiopia, a country in Africa. And I just remember being asked if I had Ebola, being asked if my family had it, just because I was from African descent. And having that experience, among other experiences with racism in my education, especially since I've only gone to predominantly white institutions, it has definitely taken an effect on my mental health, along with other students that I've talked to about this. People don't realize how much of an effect that these racist situations have on, especially elementary school students, how much it has on their mental health. It has definitely, thinking back on these situations and looking back, I realized how much, just like your son, I had nightmares. I was always terrified that people weren't gonna want to be my friend because of this. And because of that, I really want to make sure that people realize that these situations, this racist situation, it happens, it's not isolated, and it happens more often than people think. And people need to realize how much it has an effect on people's mental health.
I want to share some background information related to this whole question we're talking about. And as you'll hear, some of it relates to what Jordanis was just talking about in terms of the impact it can have on mental health. But the number of schools reporting a hate crime and the number of physical attacks with a weapon nearly doubled between 2007 16 and 2017-18, according to the U.S. Government Accountability Office. In the 2017-18 school year, nearly 6,000 hate crimes in schools were reported. These are criminal acts, not just what some people refer to as racial microaggressions, which by many accounts occur with great regularity in schools. Encountering discrimination, especially racism, has long been associated with negative effects on overall well-being, such as higher levels of stress, poor cognition, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. According to a 2021 study published by the journal Pediatrics, those who faced discrimination frequently, at least a few times a month, were around 25% more likely to be diagnosed with a mental disorder and twice as likely to develop severe psychological distress than people who didn't experience discrimination or did less often, according to a study published recently in the journal Pediatrics. So now I'm going to ask each of you to describe one thing that you think schools can do to prevent racism. And so let me go back in this order. I'm going to start with you, Lori. What do you think schools might do to prevent the kind of thing that all of you shared and the kinds of things that are showing up in statistics across the country?
The question was, what do I think schools can do to prevent racism? And I think that schools can't prevent racism. Racism is something that's taught at home. And I think what we can do is respond to it. And what we can do is teach children through their education how better to behave and take some of that racism that may be encountered in the hallway and deal with it appropriately, right? Like, so you were talking earlier about incidents of, physical assault, and I never experienced that when I was growing up, and that doesn't happen where I live now. So I don't know that I could speak to that. Most of what I hear about are reports about the microaggressions, and the schools are dealing with it through the, some social emotional learning. And I have some mixed thoughts on how well that's addressing the problem. But yeah, I don't think schools can prevent it. I think the best we can do is to teach about it and to teach why it's wrong. And that's about the best they can do. But I'm really curious to hear what other people think, especially the young lady that's the student.
I'll be curious, like you are, to hear what others think. And perhaps even if you can give an example of how educators have successfully gone about preventing racism. So can I come to you next and have you respond?
Sure. Well, in my work, I have to believe that schools can be instrumental in this. Sometimes children do commit microaggressions and racist acts because they are, in fact, ignorant. They may not know that something is racist. They may not even know the origin. Sometimes children say the N-word just for the reaction, not knowing the origin or how painful it may be to someone. As an example, going back to my son, the child in this case was suffering from a lack of either exposure and conversation. So when I met with his mother, who I actually was friends with, and we didn't realize it was each other's child, so we figured that out. She said, well, I asked him where he got that idea, and he said, well, every time we go to Whole Foods and we see the signs for the children who are like dirty and starving and poor, they're always dark. And so for him, he had made the assumption and the correlation that these children were impoverished and dirty, and that's why their skin was this color. And therefore, anyone else he saw of that color, again, belonged to this category of people. Now, aside from my family, she admitted that there were no other people that he interacted with of color. And like I said, our school was not super diverse at that time. It was a school in Maryland. But the school was very proactive and decided that part of how we prevent this kind of ignorance and that narrative that starts to go unchallenged is by positive exposure. So one of the things that people do who are trying to confront their own biases is they allow themselves to engage with things that challenge the biases they have. So for example, My husband's Italian. So when we travel, we go to lots of places with Black culture and history and people, partially because it's our family narrative and our norm to make that just normal. So this mom and I took our idea back to the school, and this was 20 years ago. They started a diversity reading club, if you will, not as broadly defined as we do today, but with the objective of helping a multicultural community to understand one another. So they changed the toys in the school so that there was more visual color diversity in the dolls and the different toys. They asked families to bring books in. We had many different faith communities as well. So they asked them to bring in different books. We started to be more deliberate about honoring different faith tradition celebrations, etc. So the objective was to get ahead of the narratives that happen when you are socially isolated from one another. It's much easier to come up with racist notions and believe they're true if the only place you get your information from is TV or negative news. And so part of what happened with social segregation through housing and policies and laws is that it made it easier for those things to take root. And so as we unroot those things, and in our schools, we allow for that sharing of our differences around, our ethnic, cultural, religious differences and so forth, teachers have a big role to play in that. And we're not even talking yet about practices that can segregate children within schools. That's probably another podcast. But as we look at these policies that unintentionally segregate children in schools along race and economics and question those and start to be a little more heterogeneous in the way we group children, you do see less racist behavior and ideas coming from them, because this idea that Lori was talking about can come back to some of our schools where the natural interaction that happens with children is actually fostered in the school.
Thanks for that. Lori, I just want to come back to you for a second. What do you think about what Kenan was suggesting there? Does that make sense to you, or are you worried about that kind of approach that she described?
She's so well spoken. I was kind of in awe. Yeah, what she said makes sense. Absolutely. And I really like the idea of, changing out some of the toys and bringing in some books, to that portray people of color in a positive way. I 100% support that. And I understood and appreciated what she said about sometimes microaggressions aren't done intentionally. And I think that's an important point too. The term racist has become so charged in today's society and as part of the culture war that when there are kids that don't have the deep understanding because they just don't live in a very diverse situation or go to school in a very diverse situation, they can't help it. And so, yes, the schools can and should be doing more to make those experiences available. But I am concerned about some of the social emotional learning that I see taking place in the elementary school. And I think the example I would give is that when my daughter was little, her very best girlfriend was Asian, and she never even noticed until the teacher pointed it out as part of the social emotional learning. And, I think sometimes we, in our quest to overcome and come together this problem, I think it may at times have an unintended or unanticipated side effect.
Thank you for that, Lori. I want to come to you, Chris, now. And you had said in your opening comments that you were concerned about your own son and whether he's going to have a more experiences than you did in some cases in diverse settings, and it was really important to you. But I would love to hear what your thoughts are about what schools can do to try to prevent racism.
I do think that schools can play a role in preventing racism. And this is, of course, an incredibly complex question. And I think it really depends upon the way that racism may present itself. So what I'd sort of like to do is speak more broadly and then maybe go into an example of one of the interventions that research has shown that has been working. So one thing is that really, educators and students need to understand the school's climate to build a prevention strategy. And I think that they really need to be able to understand what are the factors in that particular school that might be contributing to racism. They should set high expectations in their behavior for themselves, teachers, administrators, and students. And it's important for educators, of course, to be a model for students. And they should also support open and difficult conversations surrounding racism. And they should also include parents, I think, in establishing those strategies to be able to prevent racism. What I think is very important too are those interpersonal ties between the student and the teacher. So really quick, I like to, as an example, speak about suspensions, because suspensions are very strongly tied to student outcomes, including grades, dropout rates, and substance abuse risk. So minority and students with disabilities are much more likely to be suspended in schools. And there's actually some very interesting work that's being conducted at the University of California, Berkeley. And what it suggests is that using an empathic mindset intervention for teachers can help reduce bias in school suspension. So what this approach does is it focuses specifically on the teacher-student relationship, and it doesn't focus specifically on bias or racial disparities in outcomes. It shifts teachers' mindsets to be more empathic towards their students. And initial research is showing that this approach is cutting student disciplinary action in half and reducing disparities by 45%. And what's particularly notable about this is that the effects of this program go beyond the year for which it was implemented.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. Let's hear from Jordanis. Jordanis, share with us what you think schools can do to prevent racism.
It's easier said than done to just prevent racism in schools. But I think the most important thing is to get rid of this colorblind ideology. I think people use the word colorblind as a way to ignore racism in schools. And if you're just ignoring the racism in schools and you're having this colorblind approach, then you're not going to be able to effectively prevent racism in schools. I think that racism is perpetuated by silence. And if schools continue to stay silent on these issues happening in our schools, then we won't be able to actually prevent racism.
Yeah, I think there is an argument. I've heard it before, even on some of our podcasts, that to the extent that you draw attention to race, you're promoting racism. But what you're saying is that you can't avoid it, and if you do, you're gonna see more racism, not less.
So I think there is nuance here that's worth mentioning. So what Lori is talking about, I think, is important. I think what Jordanis is talking about is important. The idea that the teacher pointed out someone's ethnicity prior to the child noticing can be problematic. Children can sometimes feel triggered and actually angered by noticing a difference they didn't notice before. However, trying to teach children to be colorblind as though there are no differences and it doesn't matter is also problematic when they are in fact noticing. So children may notice differences in color as early as, preschool, but what they make of it is what we can help them to do in the classroom and in the community. Even children of color may wonder, well, why is my skin different? Why is my hair texture different? And the way you talk about that as a parent or community also matters, because we want to avoid internalized racism, where people learn to hate themselves because of what they believe the societal message is. So there's work all around in recognizing when and how children notice differences and how to talk about those differences. But simply pointing it out and essentially, otherizing someone to make the point is probably not a healthy approach either. So when I am sometimes brought to high schools to talk about crises around racist incidences, I don't really talk so specifically about the particular person and their specific race. What we talk about is othering and belonging, and the difference between bullying someone and this larger concept of hate behavior. And a lot of times, parents, in an effort to understand this, minimize it and say, well, it's just kids being kids and taunting each other. But it's another layer of harassment to believe that who you are, what you look like the minute someone sees you, makes you a target, and therefore it extends to your community and your family, is a very different level of fear and trauma that you must live with. So the idea that children can perpetuate that is obviously very dangerous, but we have to move the conversation away from just childhood bullying. It's not the same to make fun of someone's lunch as it is to make fun of their lunch because of the country they come from and the people they are and the ethnicity and the things that are attached to that. So knowing that distinction and knowing the appropriate ways in which to engage around developmental conversations is important. I think a lot of parents are angry about a lot of this DEI work because I think it is not age appropriate. I think it is not done well. I think some of it is very, very far flung from what we were originally trying to do. And I think a lot of it adultifies our children. So I actually don't like a lot of it. I don't call myself a DEI expert because I don't want to be attached to some of these things that I do not agree with. But do I believe in racial justice? Yes. Do I believe that people should not hate, not perpetuate oppression and marginalization? Yes. But there are ways to do it, and we should do a better job of helping people to appreciate that there are developmentally appropriate ways to go about teaching difference. And I think parents are right in many cases to be angry about the ways in which we're going about it.
I want to call attention to a couple of things I heard just now from Kenan. First, rather than just expressing her own opinion on my question, she first acknowledges Lauria's point and Jordanis's points as being important, and she addresses what they have to say. That may seem like a small thing, but from a bridging standpoint, it conveys to Laurie and Jordanis, and Chris for that matter, that she's listening to them, that she cares about what they think. And then she goes on to offer a very nuanced analysis of the problem of racism in schools. She also does something else that takes some courage. She expresses what she thinks are weaknesses with many DEI programs that many liberal educators and parents like herself strongly support. That's also something that is likely to encourage others in the conversation to do the same themselves. I want to move to our third question, which is what should schools do when racist acts happen? And I raise that because in my reading about what's going on in this country with respect to race and racism, and recently did an episode on anti-Semitism, which is quite problematic in a high school back in Maryland. There are some schools, many schools perhaps, that don't really have explicit policies or haven't done a lot with their staff and with parents to come up with policies and programs and ways of reacting when things come up. And I think, Kenan, as you were describing, there's a whole array of things that can happen, from just sort of common everyday bullying, which doesn't necessarily rise or isn't the same thing as bullying someone because of where they came from or what their skin color is. But just would like each of you to just comment briefly on this question of what you think schools can and should do when racist activity occurs in a school.
So what should schools do? Somebody mentioned earlier about the suspensions and how that is an indicator of not only a potential outcome, but how what we see across the country is that it's the students of color that tend to get suspended at a faster rate. So in the interim, I think diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are really important. And I'd like to see the inclusion programs include disability. What I am worried about, and I share kind of fear, is that the pendulum is swinging too far. And now we have, right here in the state of Rhode Island, we've got segregated spaces. We've got special programs that only students of color can attend, and the white kids are excluded or have their own space. We see that not just with the children, but with the teachers. And as a matter of fact, there's legislation currently pending within the Rhode Island General Assembly right now, trying to fund a program that would recruit and retain teachers of color. And I support that. I think there's a pretty good argument for for having children in a classroom with a teacher that looks like them. But I wonder if we're placing too much of an influence on skin color and not enough attention on the actual education. And what I see in our state scores is that we're not doing a good job at any of it. And I'd like to see more work done. I'd like to see less of a focus on DEI, so to speak, and more of a focus on education. And I think if we did that and also were sensitive and said, hey, kids, certain foods are associated with particular ethnic groups, and maybe you should be aware that that might hurt someone's feelings, and we don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, and just leave it at that.
Thank you for that. Jordanis, I'm going to come to you next. I'd love to hear your thoughts about maybe one thing schools can and should do when racist acts occur.
So I think it's important that schools take accountability for the racist situations happening. I mean, even today, we still see some schools ignoring situations. I've seen teachers ignore racist situations in my own school district. And I think that it's important to first take accountability of the issue. And once you take accountability of the issue, then you're really able to have an open conversation where you're able to talk about like what actually happened and what practices can we make to resolve this issue happening.
Great. Chris, your thoughts on what schools should do when racism occurs?
Sure. Just to echo what was just said, teachers and administrators need to acknowledge when something happens, and they can't try to deflect responsibility, right? They also need to be able to understand why the incident happened, what the motivations were, and then try to take steps to reduce the probability that it'll happen again. If I were to focus in on, I guess, one policy direction or one place to go, I would say access to mental health support. For example, here in Texas, more than 80% of the counties are mental health professional shortage areas, and that's defined as having more than 30,000 residents per practitioner. And what some of my work has seen is that even when there is mental health or there are mental health services in a particular school, and those services are even at the levels that you would expect them to be, students are not always they're not always willing to approach those services. And mental health professionals need to be able to train to handle incidents of racism and should be able to contribute to a school's culture. And with that, those mental health professionals should be integrated with the school's functionality and also regularly communicate with parents so that they know best how to approach a student when something occurs.
Chris, when you refer to mental health support, are you talking about the victims of racism as well as the people who have committed these acts?
I would say yes, it should be an all of the above approach. Individuals should be available for those who were the victims, who witnessed the incident occurring, and also those that partook in the incident.
Ken, I want to come to you. What are your thoughts about how schools should respond when these things happen?
Yeah, and I think again that the reason that I don't lead with DEI expert is the same reason that schools have a challenge with this. I think if we were to think about this as humanizing one another, it is a more universal language that people understand. Many parents do not want their children to be perpetrators of race and racial hate, violence, et cetera. And sometimes, again, they bristle at the term racist or DEI. But when I talk to them about, what it might be like for someone to come from a group to feel unsafe all the time, every day, being bullied. And I mean, this is happening around me. I get calls, I get emails. It is extremely traumatizing for the entire family. And when parents understand it from that perspective, they're more willing to empathize and listen rather than coming in and talking about structural racism, for example. But I do want to touch a little bit on programs that are meant to do things like retain teachers of color and what that's about. I think one of the things that is challenging in our country is that there is a through line from our legacy of enslaving other people and where we are today as a society. And part of the representation efforts include retaining individuals in a profession where once we were no longer legally segregated, there was still a lot of hostility with people coming together, including the adults. And so part of that work has been to create these affinity spaces for people of color, which can seem irrelevant and maybe reverse segregation, but it is hard to communicate one's lived experience to someone who just doesn't have that day-to-day experience. And when you are in rooms where you feel understood, seen, and heard and supported in a specific kind of way, it makes it likelier for you to succeed. I don't think it should be a zero-sum game where some people get things and others do not. But the fact that we do have such different lived histories in the United States is why these affinity spaces tend to be helpful, and these targeted approaches tend to be helpful. I can't really explain in a matter of a limited podcast what it's like to be the first Black elected official in my town, Black person on my school committee, and have someone try to basically attack me in public because they didn't understand why I'd gotten on the school committee. They didn't ask anybody else how they got on school committee. I have a PhD. She didn't care. She wouldn't refer to me by my name. And it was an incident that became public in our town because our town was shocked that someone would actually do that. And without saying it, they understood that the way I look raised an alarm for someone. And that's not an experience I can share with just anybody. There are people for whom that is something they live daily and can relate to me on. And therefore, that affinity space where maybe I can talk about that is valuable to me. But it's not meant for me to segregate from the rest of society in lieu of having these spaces. I think we can do both well, but we have to do them with the objective of unifying our community. It's not meant to be a space where you segregate yourself and remove yourself. But there are times where what you are going through as an individual really is so unique to your community or to your group that that is where you go for solace. And I know that there are many other types of affinity spaces, but oftentimes when they're around race and ethnicity, they can be charging to people. They can be confusing. It can be concerning about their objective or how helpful they are. But I'll leave you with one example. I was working with the school district and someone talked to me about, the worry about creating affinity spaces. I don't think we should run amok with them, but I do think they can serve a good purpose. And I tried to get her to think through whether she belonged to any affinity spaces. This was a white woman. And she said, well, come to think of it, I have a child, but I'm an adoptive mother. And when I started going to mothers groups, I didn't give birth to my child, so I couldn't relate to anything they were talking about as new moms. And I felt really awkward and ashamed, and I didn't want to be there. But then I realized there were groups for moms like me who had adopted their children. And then I felt like I belonged. I felt like I understood. And when she and I had that exchange, she finally understood why it might be the case that some parents who are having similar experiences around their ethnicity, race, or place of origin might want to be together.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And Lori, I want to come to you, and I see your hand is up because you had expressed some concern about what I think Kenan is referring to now as affinity groups, and worried about the thing that she actually addressed in her comments, which is it could look like it could be divisive, and yet she was describing it as having another purpose. I wonder what your thoughts are about what you just heard.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. And I think that was a great explanation of why that might be needed. But when you set up an affinity space and you're a school, right, you're a government institution that's publicly funded, and there are laws against discrimination based on race. And so if parents want to get together and say, hey, we're going to meet at Starbucks and have coffee and have a conversation, that's one thing. If teachers want to do the same, that's one thing. But when you are a government or publicly funded institution and you're engaging in segregation, I have a concern with that. I still do. And I really appreciated the comparison with the adoptive moms versus the skin color, because that it helped me understand her thinking, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, and I totally get where you're going with that, and I can understand how that could run amok. And I do think we have to be careful about the objective of the spaces. And I do not believe you can bar students from participating in those spaces. Obviously, with the name of it, like if you're in the Glee Club and you hate singing, you may not want to go. But right, I played the trombone and I had no business in the Glee Club. But I don't know that you can exclude students on the basis of their race and interest. But I do think you can create spaces where maybe it's for the students who are learning English as a second language and want extra practice. Maybe that means that now you're pulling in their cultural and ethnic origin and we're able to support them in that way. I was a part of the Caribbean Students Association because it made me feel less anxiety and it helped me to learn to navigate the United States and to understand how things work. And that was in my college level experience. But again, it didn't mean that we couldn't have people who were not of that group there. And I think if that kind of exclusion happens, where it's like you're barred, you're excluded, you don't know, I can see how that could seem counterintuitive. And so I don't know the specific policies you're talking about, but I think that obviously people may opt into a space because they find it relevant. But I think if we get to the point where we're creating exclusion and division and other types of, isms and schisms, then we do have to make sure that that is not an unintended consequence.
There's so much more we could talk about with on this topic. I just want to quickly go around and have each of you share just a takeaway from today's conversation, not only about the substance of it, but the way we had the conversation. Kenan, let me start with you.
I just have to say, I wish we were all together. I'm so excited. I feel like I want to get to know everybody on this call so much better, and I could do this for another hour. I really, really appreciate hearing a student perspective. I want to hear more about Chris's perspective, particularly coming from the Republican Party, because I think that there's a lot of opportunity there that we don't hear about and we don't really do in our very polarized spaces. And I think that what Lori is talking about, I would love to have had more time to talk about how do we address systemic things that have happened appropriately today, and how do we do a good job of not creating new ways that we are bifurcating our society in response. So I would have loved to have that conversation, and maybe in the future we'll be able to do that. But I really loved hearing what everybody had to say. I really respected your comments, and you're all so smart.
Kenan, thanks so much for being part of this courageous conversation. I really appreciated your involvement. Chris, let me come to you and hear your thoughts about what your takeaway is from today.
No, thank you so much. And I of course wish we could keep this conversation going as well, and we could all, see each other in person and have a roundtable with this. But as mentioned with a little bit with the Republican Party and such, I've been active in politics since I was 16. I was a precinct delegate up in Michigan, a precinct committeeman in Indiana, and now a precinct chair back, in Texas. And speaking of polarization, it is something that concerns me, and it does concern me that we can't have as many good conversations, and that those that want to have good conversations are being drowned out, because there are solutions out there. There are excellent policy solutions out there. But oftentimes they're not discussed because it's really just individuals yelling at each other, right? And, just going back a little bit about what was being said before, all of this is, important to me because, my son, he's, Latino and, white. And, my wife and I kind of grapple about, well, how is he going to identify himself? In terms of these programs, is he going to check that he's Hispanic and Latino, or is he going to check that he's white? And what would we like him to do? And, we want him, of course, to be accepting of others. We want other people to accept him. And having conversations like this, I think, will make sure that, or help make sure that he's able to be with individuals across all of our society and spectrum. So I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit right now, but the polarization does have me disheartened. I'm just so happy that I was included in this conversation, and hope we could keep things going.
Jordanis, I'm going to come to you next. Just a takeaway for you from today's conversation.
So I couldn't agree more with Chris. I think that polarization is killing our country, and people have become so divided in conversations. I mean, even in families, people stop talking to family members because of political differences. And I think having these type of conversations are so helpful. And again, I would love to have a conversation further with all of you, maybe in person, and actually go into like the structural things in the education system that are affecting us.
Thanks, Jordanis. And Finally, Laura, your thoughts on today and what it meant to you and what you're taking away from it.
Thank you, Ken. I just can't say how pleased I am to be included and with all these bright minds that I have really enjoyed the conversation. I think the biggest takeaway that I had was something that Ken said about the adoptive moms and the affinity groups and Jordanis. I really enjoyed just listening to her. She has such a fresh perspective, and I'm gonna reflect on a lot of the things that she said because her experience has been so different from my own and what my daughter is experiencing. And Chris, you've just been fabulous with your policy talk and the Republican Party, and I do think that there's room for some policy changes within the Republican Party in order to at least to actually be more welcoming, but certainly to appear more welcoming. And I think that's something I'm excited to watch you in the future perform.
After I thanked my guests for being part of this courageous conversation, I reflected a bit on what happened. The fact that two conservatives and two liberals had a fruitful dialogue about a potentially contentious issue, the fact that they all wanted to continue the conversation with each other, illustrates to me that when we set the right tone, that when we ask people with different perspectives to be curious and not confrontational, they often do. The challenge, or maybe the opportunity, is this: how do we create spaces where these depolarized exchanges can take place on the ground in local school districts? It's not in official school board meetings, that's for sure, but I have found they can happen in other settings where participants in small groups agree to follow a few simple conversation agreements, like the ones used by an organization called Living Room Conversations. Be curious, seek to understand, don't interrupt, be respectful. I've been using these simple agreements for local events I call schoolhouse conversations. Parents, educators, school board members often come together and actually have lively civil conversations on challenging topics, like the ones we had today about racism. That's no small thing at a time when the culture wars, during an unprecedented era of toxic polarization, threaten to tear apart our schools. Well, if you're interested in learning more about this approach, take a look at the episode notes on our website, schoolconversations.org. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. So long, everyone.